Well, good evening. This is a Dvar Torah on Parshas Vayechi, the final parsha in the first book of the Chumash, Sefer Bereshis. I would like this shir to be dedicated as an aliyah, as neshima, for my paternal great-grandfather, Leib ben Asher Yosef, on the occasion of his 82nd yahrzeit. And there's a lot of significant things going on in this week's Parsha. What we start with here is we see that Yaakov has spent 17 years in Mitzrayim since they came down there. And it says, the first passage says, Vichi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim, Sheva Esrei, Shana Vihi Yemei Yaakov, Sheni Chaya Sheva Shanim, and Arba'in Meir Shana, and Krov Yemei Israel Lemot, Yimikil B'nei Yosef, B'nei Yosef, Merlo. Then it goes on to say he has make certain requests. Now it says, Yaakov made Egypt his home for 17 years. He lived to be 147 years old. And when Israel realized they would die soon, he called his son Yosef, and then goes on to discuss other things. He makes Yosef take an oath that he will have him buried in land of Eretz Canaan, in the cave of Machpelah, where his grandparents and parents and his wife Leah were already buried. And he makes Yosef swear it, which was significant, I explain in a second. He then goes and blesses Yosef and then his sons Ephraim and Menashe, and treats them like equal sons. Then he calls the sons together and grandsons, actually grandchildren, and he gives blessings to the tribes, his sons. And after that, which takes up has a deep significance, takes up a good part of the parsha, and he then passes away, though he didn't die. That's a whole discussion in itself. And he's in a sense still alive. And then Yosef requests to Pharaoh's house that he be allowed to bury him up there in Eretz Canaan. Pharaoh didn't want to him, but he said, if you don't let me take you and keep my oath to my father, I don't have to keep the oath to you, which had been he promised Pharaoh he wouldn't reveal that he was wiser and knew one more language. Pharaoh knew 70 languages, but he didn't understand the deeper significance of the Hebrew language, which Yosef did. He allowed him to go up. Then the reason was all the Egyptian officials went. So it was like a diplomatic state, as my teacher, Rabbi Yossi Yomaleski, said, that the land, that it was like an embassy. The government were with him, so he never left Egypt. Just like when you go into enter an embassy, you're technically, legally in the land of that country whose embassy it is, not in the country surrounding it. As Yosef's brothers are fearful, they make up that Yaakov gave commandment. He told him he was not, they didn't have to worry. And Yosef lived to 110 years, and he made the Jewish people promise that they would take him out when they were going to be eventually liberated. And that's how the Parsha ends. Now, what I would like to deal with is the beginning of the Parsha, where it says, they said, the years Yaakov made his home in Egypt for 17 years, he lived to be 147 years. Now, if you look at that and you subtract 17 from 147, you get 130 years. I'd like to discuss what the significance of that 100, the deeper significance of that 130 years are. And in fact, it was alluded to in the previous Parsha when Yaakov comes is asked by Pharaoh, "How old are you?" And Yaakov answers, "V'yomer Yaakov el Pharaoh, Yemei sheni megura, right? Shloshim ma'eya shanim ma'at v'ra'im v'yehu Yemei shenei chaya lo yisig et Yemei shenei chaya avo Yemei megurehem." That my journey through life has lasted 130 years, replied Yaakov. The days of my life have been few and hard. I did not live as long as my fathers did during their pilgrimage in life. Why are the years hard? In fact, bigger question, why did Yaakov have to suffer like that? Now, there's many reasons given, one some of which I've discussed in previous Torahs. However, if you look at the word, it says, what is Yud Zion? He had 17 years. What is the gematria? Every Hebrew letter has gematria. What does it mean if you count out the letters? It has the same gematria as Tov, Tet, Vav, Bet. And the Arizal goes on to explain in the Likutei Torah that Lo Hayar Yaakov Shalom, Shalfa, peace and calmness, whatever, Behem, and Nosa Chaim Chaye Yaakov, the Kuf Lamed were Ra'im. Now, why did they have to be? Reduced in evil. Now, why did they have to be? Because to understand this properly, you have to go back to the time of Adam Rishon, because Adam Rishon had 130 years where he was committing sins, and Yaakov was a Gilgal of Rishon, and to do a tikkun to compensate for the evil he did, those years, evil actions he did. Yaakov had to suffer 130 years as a tikkun. Now that's the explanation in the Likutei Torah. However, I would like to explain it in more detail from another commentary called Megillah Muka. It's the commentary on the Chumash of Rav Nata Shapira, was the Yav based in Krakow in the 1500s in Poland, and it wrote on his his tombstone, his makseva, that he learned directly from Eliyahu Hanavi, which is something that very few very holy individuals were able to do. And he had incredible stories about him. But just to say he was an extremely spiritual individual, not only knew what was going on in this world, even when he was alive, he knew what some things were going on in the next world, and in the Beis Din Lamala. And I would like to go with his explanation. And he starts with a quote from the Gemara in the Yerushalmi, the Talmud Yerushalmi, in Zara, in Seder Zorayim and Kalayim Periktet Malchut Gimel. And it says Vichi Rebbe Yehuda Sipori Sheva Eser Shana. And he lived for 17 years. Doesn't mean that's the lifetimes, but he lived for 17 years we're talking about. Now, what is the significance of that? How does that work out? So who was he? In depth and secret, he was a guru, a reincarnation of a spark, holy spark of Yaakov, Avinu. And he was called Nasi, Yehuda Nasi, in other words, the inventor, the head of the generation that compiled the Mishnah, wrote down the Mishnayos. And who was he connected to? He was a friend of the Roman emperor, Antonius. And he, in fact, they were both extremely wealthy. They had a connecting underground passage tunnel, and they learned Torah. He secretly, at the end of his life, converted to Judaism, Antonius. And where was he from? He was a spark, Mesav the Russia. He was a descendant of Esav. And he was it? They said there were 8 kings in Rome. He was a descendant of one of those. There was a king in Israel, which has its whole meaning from Parshas the Yishlach. And no, he was from the house of Shem, his descendant. And now to Rivka, she went to Hashem, had a prophecy. Some say it was through the Shiva Hashem. Either way, that she couldn't understand why why the baby was fighting. When the baby went near a place with Vodazora, got excited. Also, when it went near the Yeshiva of Shem and Everett, got excited. And she learned that there were 2 nations in one stomach, in her womb, and you have to understand that she saw that it would come from her mother-in-law, Sarah Menu, who was a Sadekis. But again, there was impurities that had to come out. It came out. So why was Yitzhak a pure son? Because the impurities from Abraham went to his union with Agar, which produced Shifker, Sarah. And you see the same thing with Yitzchak. And the impurities had to go out, except this time not with another woman. Same woman, Rivka. However, this time, Rivka was carrying 2 children. One was pure, and one was impure. And ultimately, to get rid of the impurity of Esav, and it happened through Antonius, as I explained, and from there, that evil traits never came back, and aspect of Esau, and he explains, and this is apropos to what the brief quote of the Arizal, that Yaakov was, as I said, was a tikkun for Adam Rishon, because he ate from the Eitz Hadas of Tov and Ra, and that led him to have a combination of good and evil within him. And there was a mixture in there, impurities and good. It was a teruvis mixture. The evil part, as I said, from we explained above, came out from Hakah, and therefore, because Adam Rishon had committed sins for 130 years, and he had to make a tikkun of that, to get rid of that evil, to elevate himself. And so the 17 remaining years he had were tov, were good, because he had purified himself. And Yosef was the purification process, which had started with Abraham, who said he ran to be pure. He ran to get a calf and what have you. That he had to, that he was doing good, that he was becoming pure. And so what happened? And but Abraham said that all good stuff should come to Abraham. You see this concept of Tov again. And we also see that 17 appearing again with Yosef, because he said he was good for those 17 years. And then he got exiled and he went down to Egypt. And what happened then is he went to Eretz Mitzrayim. The Tov of the Eretz, the Mitzrayim, Hashem is going to come to you. What does that mean? That Yosef came, and however, it was the Batim Ra'ah, the Batim of evil, mixed the evil in Adam Rishon, and that Chaya Ra'ah was eaten, was food provided, food. In other words, it was a mixture of Tov and Ra, and what's going to happen from here on in is after that, the Jewish people had to go down. They had to deal with these spiritual impurities. I gave more of an introduction on this last week's Devar Torah. And what do we learn from this? That through all of this, there was a purification. And what do we learn from us ourselves is that just like they were doing tikkuns, we're now going through a purification process at the end of the days to finally get rid of all the influences. This is like a Mashiach. And after we got out of Egypt, we took all of the spiritual content. We've been through all the world. And now we're doing the final tikkun, the final improvement, so that this process that started way back with Adam and Rishon, went to Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and Yosef, shall be completed and later Moshe Rabbeinu should be completed by us, and we should merit the redemption soon. Good Shabbos and Shabbat Shalom.